Hi, welcome to Come to Think of It, a program where we talk about things that matter. I'm your host, KC Scott, and my guest today is Roget Lockard, an addictions counselor of great repute, and we've been talking about the nature of addiction, so welcome back, Roget.
Thanks, Casey.
Now, in our last discussion, we talked about the addict bottoming out, and the progression of addiction, and then the addict bottoming out. Mm-hmm. And so that brings us to a crucial point. And at the end of that program, we just made an observation that this is the bottom is a condition that is fraught with danger, and mm-hmm. that many people do die in that condition, whether by suicide or otherwise. Mm-hmm. And there's an alternative to that, and that is sobriety. So I think we've come to the point where we want to turn our discussion around and talk about sobriety. Mm-hmm. And I think we might start with what most people would perceive to be the key essential ingredient to sobriety, and that would be abstinence. Mm-hmm. So how does an alcoholic or addict achieve abstinence when they're in this condition of absolute total dependence?
The most succinct, but probably far from adequate answer is by saying no. Nancy Reagan was pointing in the right direction when she said, just say no. Mm. But unfortunately, she had one too many words, that being the word just. Yeah. An example that I like to offer a lot of times when I'm working with clients for whom this whole process is new and perhaps speculative, they're not sure if they're sold or not. And for many of them, as for myself, I remember in my early struggles with my alcoholism, my experience led me to believe that I had the choice between what was initially a lively and enlivening way of being in the world that was offered to me by my drinking and other chemicals, and then increasingly more and more troubles. Or if I decided to just say no, mm-hmm. A kind of a flatland existence where I got along fine. Mm-hmm. People were pleased to see me not getting into trouble and not being trouble for them, but inside, I think I've talked about this in earlier conversations, I felt like what was missing was the best part. And this is words I've put to it much later after I got into sobriety myself. So the way I try to describe what's going on, or in a teasing kind of a way a lot of times for clients, is I pick up a pad or a lap desk or something like that, and I say, this is the journey of, this is the game of life. And when we first discover our addictive fix, it feels like we've somehow gotten a roll of the dice that says, oh, you get to move way, way, way ahead in the game of life for free, effortlessly, which is wonderful, except, of course, it turns out that not only do you regress, but you end up falling off the board so that you're not really a participant in any kind of a rich and meaningful sense. So what I say is, what abstinence does. Now, John Q. Public out there, John and Jane Public, tend to think, understandably, that sobriety is a synonym for abstinence, and vice versa. But in fact, what I say is, abstinence is simply getting back on the board at go. Mm-hmm. And if abstinence is all you're doing, then you are not advancing yourself one iota in the game of life. And so abstinence is saying no. which on the face of it sounds simple, and in some instances is simple, not necessarily easy. Sometimes not at all easy, but it's still simple. With alcoholism, for example, other chemical addictions, but there are, and we've talked about this, I believe, in passing, there are many addictions where abstinence is not at all a clear-cut kind of thing, such as the vast addictions to eating, to food.
Sure.
So I won't belabor that point except to say that at the heart of every abstinence is a no. But what that particular no is turns out to be much more individual than most people imagine. An awkward but apt little axiom that I've concocted for this goes like this. My task is to find my way of letting go, of needing things to go my way. In other words, I have to find the way of saying no that is authentic for me, and has integrity, because if it doesn't, it won't work. God knows addicts try to bargain with the universe about, well, is this close enough? That looks like no, doesn't it?
How about just one?
Yeah. So many different twists and turns, just for this weekend, whatever it may be. But once we reconcile, okay, for today, and I think many people understand that one of the principles of the 12-step approach to sobriety, which is certainly the one that I wholeheartedly recommend and embrace, is one day at a time. So for this one day, my no is unqualified.
Okay, there is a conundrum here.
Yeah, at least one.
At least one, yeah. And that is that as you've discussed many times in these conversations, the addiction is really about control. And the need to, or the perceived need to control this experience of self. However, that exercise of will has failed, and failed mightily.
Gone bankrupt.
Failed mightily. So now we come to abstinence, and the answer is just say no, which seems like an exercise of will.
But it's not the answer. It's the precondition to begin to assemble the answer.
Yes. But how do you get around that problem of the lack of willpower that the addict has at that crucial point?
It's only in the very rarest of occasions that you find someone who literally can't go one day. Rarely do they say, if you say, look, can you just not have a drink or whatever it is for one day? With the rarest of exceptions, they'll say, well, yeah, but that's irrelevant. I've done that. Who was it, Mark Twain, who said, quitting smoking is easy. I've done it 1,000 times. And typically other addicts will have their own version of that, as did I. And in the rare cases where people literally can't say no, that's almost always because they're in a grip of a physical dependency, and they need a detox, a medical detox. What happens frequently is that if and when people get it, that saying no is not the answer, but simply a precondition to qualify, to begin to pursue, to assemble, to acquire, to evolve. I was going to say to evolve the answer, but to evolve into the answer. And it becomes, just as we've talked all along about how the control technologies or methodologies of all the different addictions are on behalf of existential enhancement, so is sobriety. And so a great deal of the work that I do is really on behalf of enticing, of teasing my clients, the folks that I work with, into realizing, this isn't, the saying no, you say no for today, and then what happens is potentially today opens up.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, if I'm not going, if I haven't established for sure that I'm not going to drink today, then it's right here. It's always hovering. It's a distraction, and sometimes, of course, a terminal distraction. I end up going out and drinking. But even if I don't drink, I'm mightily preoccupied, in the rich sense of that word, by this question. Well, will I or won't I? Probably not. No, it'd be about. But there's no room for the rest of one's life. But if one says, okay, for today, between now and when I go to bed tonight, because some of us are lawyers now, in the figurative sense at least, mm-hmm. and we say, well, I want to have a drink today, but it's 11:45. So,
it's almost tomorrow.
It's almost tomorrow. So, we have to get clear. What is today? Today is, what I recommend is between now and when I go to sleep tonight,
yes.
whenever that is.
Yeah.
Okay, we get that monkey business out of the way.
Right. We're not making any deals here.
Oh, yeah. Well then what am I going to do with today?
Mm-hmm.
And
that's a question that a lot of people ask, I think, when they're newly sober. It's,
what
on earth am I going to do now?
Well, absolutely. And a lot of what the first answer is to endure and discover that I can endure the pain, mm-hmm. and to discover that the pain, while real and oftentimes pretty considerable, is bearable for one day.
Yeah.
For one day.
Yeah.
You may remember that in one of our off-camera conversations, I talked about the very first paper that I wrote on the subject of addiction. Talks about what were originally 4 levels of trust. Mm-hmm. And the first one is the primitive realization, oh my God, I have stopped doing the thing that has bound my life together, that has integrated my life, that has been the one seemingly viable path to meaning and adventure and so forth, that has been my existential glue. And I stopped doing that, and yet I'm still here. In the rawest form of stating it, I am, is that first level of trust. Mm. That's not necessarily delightful news.
Just to interrupt you for a second, because I know that there's more to this.
I don't. Yeah.
But it occurred to me that experience of being able to endure that pain is in itself the beginning of a transformation of self.
There's a dignification.
Yeah.
There is a demonstration of some courage, some integrity, often qualities of humility. All of these characterological features that may not have been very prominent in their life.
Yeah.
For a good long while, anyway.
So that's the first level of trust.
Yeah, that's the first level of trust. I don't think that I want to try to walk all the way through all 3, but the second one is well worth mentioning because it's all about this abstinence thing, and that is I can choose. I can make an effective choice in my life, mm-hmm. as long as I'm just trying to make it for this day. As I believe I've already mentioned, I tried to quit drinking for the rest of my life at least a dozen times.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember when I ended up in the drunk farm and someone was speaking to my sense of despair about being able to have a viable, sober life. And they said, well, you can not drink today, right? And I was so irritated with them. Well, of course I can not drink today. I've done that dozens of times. And they said, well, settle for that. And I was so unhappy with them except for one thing. And I believe I've mentioned that also. And that was a quality in their faces, in their eyes, and the way they could laugh. And that made me hungry.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be one of the real key features of how and why AA has had such a singular record historically of effectiveness in helping alcoholics become sober, but I don't think I want to settle for that. And helping alcoholics help one another to become sober.
Yeah. And that's an important point, because this has been an intractable problem throughout history.
Yeah.
And there have been many attempts to solve it, most of which have failed miserably.
Mm-hmm.
And as we discussed in another conversation, there have been occasional instances. We talked about St. Augustine, Francis Tompkins, the poet, and there are a number of cases like that.
Most churches have a member or two who got sober, who had a conversion experience, who got sober, and I would say sober in the rich sense of the word.
And I know a couple of people like that who have nothing to do with Alcoholics Anonymous.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, either out of indifference or antagonism, but they found the essential ingredients in another setting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's also an important point, because as we also discussed, it's worth mentioning here that I'm very familiar with this material, because I have many friends who are in Alcoholics Anonymous who have taken pains to educate me about this, and I've actually found it useful to incorporate some of these principles into my own life. But that's an important point. I lost my train of thought.
You were talking about there were many other attempts, but AA seems to have been singularly.
Yes, and the fact that it is one alcoholic working with another one, and it's not about any dogma. It's not about any preachments. It's nothing more than human compassion, really. And the other point that I lost and have just regained here is that this is not. I have found nothing in the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous that is new. It's all ancient wisdom, available many places, but somehow not available to addicts otherwise.
Well, AA has a pamphlet that I recommend to anyone who has any interest in the whole subject of addiction and its resolution. And that's called A Member's Eye View of AA. It was written a number of decades ago by an AA member who was addressing, it was the text of an address to a class of people studying to be counselors. And there are many valuable things in that message, but the one that has struck me from the beginning as most illuminating is where, after he has systematically gone through the content of the 12 steps and demonstrated that there is, in fact, nothing new there, that centuries ago, in many different traditions, these pieces of wisdom and understanding were articulated. So he said, okay, if there's nothing novel in the content of these 12 steps, could it be in their manner of presentation? And indeed, this was a very key moment in the formation of the program, when AA was just coming together as a body of understanding, as a cluster of a few dozen barely sober alcoholics. When the first version of that book, the big book of AA, was written, there were exactly 2 members who had at least 5 years of sobriety. That was the 2 co-founders,
Yes.
Bill W. and Dr. Bob. And my memory is that there were all of 10 people who had 2 years or more.
Wow.
And there were about 100 people then, but most of them had less than 2 years. So this was all coming. It
was pretty
deeply
brand new.
miraculous
Yeah.
that this happened. But they arrived through much contention and argumentation and so forth at the conclusion that they needed to not have dogma and doctrine, although they were, on the one hand, they were so earnest and they wanted this to work. So you have to just sock it to them and tell them this is what you must do. But they kept running into the part of themselves that said, I didn't respond so well to this is what you must do.
Yeah.
So they ended up formulating the 12 steps, as anyone can find by reading them, as things that they had done. Here are the suggested steps. Here are the things that we did. And they're suggested, not imperative. And indeed,
I think the book actually uses the word suggested.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And also toward the end of the first part of the text, before it gets into the stories of AA members, it makes the, I think, invaluable assertion, we know but little, and more will be revealed. That's uncommon.
Yes.
In texts of spiritual teachings, not unprecedented, but exceptional. So the author of this pamphlet went on to say that he'd often wondered what the history of the world might have gone like had the 10 Commandments been articulated in that kind of a voice, rather than thou shalt and thou shalt not. Simply, we honored our father and our mother. We did not kill. We did not take the Lord's name in vain, so forth and so on. This is what you must do. No.
Yeah.
This is what we did that we found that worked very well for us.
We suggest.
And it's a compelling.
It's a marvelous innovation, actually.
Yeah.
One of the things that we were talking about when we were discussing the history off camera was the Washingtonians, which was a movement in the 19th century, which actually was very effective in helping alcoholics recover for a while. And then it disintegrated, and for largely this reason.
The reason that they tended toward a dogmatic description of what to do, as did indeed the Oxford group, which AA spun off of, but in addition, the Washingtonians, I think Bill W. and early AA members thought so also. They got into trouble because they undertook to become a movement to change alcoholism in the society. A wonderful cause, to be sure. But they ran into the troubles that reform movements unfailingly run into, and the squabbles and the contentions, and they were relatively short-lived. Whereas AA very intentionally and very provocatively, and to my knowledge, well, some people say that the very early Christian communities actually had a great deal in common with AA.
Yes.
I'm not a student who can speak to that, but it's an idea that
That's my understanding
seems
from
credible.
reading the Book of Acts. Yes.
So we're going a little off here, but this is one of my favorite parts of the whole AA history, and that is there's one point where Bill W. was talking about how they felt like, they wanted AA to have as little organization as possible, but, they realized that their experience taught them that if they were really going to have lasting effectiveness And here's where you expect them to say, we got to get our stuff together, and we have to have rules, and we have to have responsible parties, and act like grown-ups, and so forth. But what Bill says is that if we were to survive and be truly effective for the sick and suffering alcoholics, AA as such ought to have no organization whatsoever, which is a very, what's the word that I want? Original, a very uncommon path.
Yeah, very uncommon.
Yeah.
Yes, no bylaws, no constitution, no president.
Right.
Yeah. Along with that, it's worth noting that there's a second set of suggestions, which many people who are familiar with the steps may not be familiar with, and that is the traditions, which are basically to prevent the sort of thing that happened to the Washingtonians, I understand. It's just to help them get along with each other.
Yeah. The steps themselves, is it timely to get back to them?
Oh, absolutely, yes, because this was all...
How are we doing?
Well, we're running a little short of time, but it's, we definitely need to... well, with that introduction as the origin of this method, for want of a better word, I think, yes, we definitely want to start talking about the steps.
Let me, if I may, share a formulation that occurred to me recently. As you know, I reflect on these things just because I'm that kind of creature, as I think you are. And it dawned on me that one extremely succinct summary is to say that the 12 steps have two essential components. The first is discover who you really are. The second is be faithful to that.
Which actually makes perfect sense because it resolves the whole problem of addiction in the first place, which is this need to have a consistent, satisfying concept of self.
Existential viability.
Yes.
Yeah. And fulfillment.
Yes. Yeah. And you had another sort of encapsulated version of the steps that I found very interesting too.
There's mine that I was pleased with, and then I realized that Dr. Bob, the other co-founder, had done an even more simple job. Mine was surrender control, accept responsibility, practice compassion, practice indiscriminate compassion is the way I like to put it. But Dr. Bob said, trust God, clean house, help others. He wins. Happily.
Yes. That sort of encapsulation it's kind of mind-boggling to think that something like this can be boiled down to something that simple. But it can, and we'll take it up in more detail when we meet next time. Thank you very much for joining me, Roget, and thank you for joining us on Come to Think of It. Hope you'll be with us next time. Until then, drive cheerfully. I'm Casey Scott.